The Myth of the 20th Century by Alfred Rosenberg. Introduction to the English edition provided by James B. Whisker, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of Political Science, West Virginia University, August 1980. Along with A.H.'s My Struggle and Ermin Goring's Germany Reborn, Alfred Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century created the basis of German National Socialist political thought. It may be compared with these other two works on several fronts. All three authors were practitioners of the social and political thought which they taught. None wrote in a vacuum. All were a part of the formation of their milieu. All saw the same perils in store with the political system which had operated through to 1933, referencing the Weimar Republic. All were anti-Semitic, although Goring was overtly less so than the other two, referring to A.H. and Alfred Rosenberg. All were super-nationalists who operated in a world that was being drawn into a powerful internationalism. The myth can be viewed as a sequel to Stuart Houston Chamberlain's Foundation of the 19th Century. It is like that work, yet it differs from the foundations in a number of vital ways. It filled many of the expectations Chamberlain had, although it changed a number of his goals. It could not have been written without the foundations, and it is more than a sequel. Rosenberg was influenced by a number of writers of the German past. Some are seen quite openly, notably Meister Eckhart. Others are observed in influence and thought only by the trained reader. These include Nietzsche, Wagner, and Ludwig Jahn. Rosenberg was the logical culmination of much of the German mind, and he was a principal shaper of that mind, at least during the period between 1933 and 1945, the rise and fall of the National Socialist Party. Rosenberg was wholly loyal to Adolf Hitler, but he conflicted on major points with others in Hitler's camp. His feud with Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels is almost legendary and cannot wholly be reconciled within standard National Socialist thought. It struck at the basis of the new state system, where Goebbels favored a modern, concentrated, industrial state. Rosenberg preferred a rural, medieval, dispersed society. The title of Rosenberg's book was chosen carefully. It was a book that was designed to guide Germany and the other Nordic nations in the present century. Once accepted, used, and promulgated, its ideas would necessarily shape Germany for the proverbial 1,000 years of Hitler's Reich. It was a blueprint which offered certain theories, ideas, and designs for the rebirth of the Nordic race. It listed the evils of the present era, while others an overview of their origins. It would have been incomprehensible to the minds of the 16th, 17th, 18th, or 19th centuries. The myth suggested in the title is more complex. A myth is an idea which can be used in many ways. If I am unable to explain something directly, I may choose to concoct a myth by using an allegory of what is known. For those who cannot understand directly, I may offer an explanation by analogy. If this story becomes a guiding light, it takes on mythic qualities. A myth may also explain what is, by any terms, holy and explicable. I may not be able to know the German god directly, but I may speak of him indirectly, as by myth. Myth is used to speak the unspeakable, fathom the unfathomable, and think the unthinkable. It thus becomes a reflection of what is known, but the myth is still other than the thing in it itself. A myth may also be a truth which is greater than conventional truth. In the writings of the medieval scholastic school led by Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus, which was made of metaphysical truth, the term meta means beyond, and metaphysics suggests something which is beyond the physical reality we know and can experience. It is something beyond and above mere empirical verification. It is known to be true inwardly in one's conscience or soul. Myth, for Rosenberg, takes on all of these characteristics of metaphysical truth and is limited by none of them. I know that God exists not by direct observation or by direct contact or by placing God under a microscope. Nonetheless, his existence is a reality beyond a shadow of doubt. Myth is, of course, more than a tale, an analogy, or metaphysical truth as it is applied in Rosenberg's great work. Myth is a moving and shaping directive, power. It resides not only in the individual but in the race. It resides in the person exclusively because he is a part of that race or culture. A strong and a great myth may have such power that it can extend its vital spark to another of a different racial culture because that individual resides in the myth-bearing culture. Myth is, of course, more than a tale, an analogy, or metaphysical truth as it is applied in Rosenberg's great work. Myth is a moving and a shaping directive power. It resides not only in the individual, but in his race. It resides in the person exclusively because he is part of that race or culture. A strong and a great myth may have such power that it can extend its vital spark to another of a different racial culture because that individual resides in the myth-bearing culture. No one factor accounts for a myth. It is a part of one's whole heritage. It is born in the person. Even if an individual becomes a part of another culture, he is called deep down inside by his own myth. It is a sum total of the culture, mores, folkways, customs, arts, traditions, legends, history, experience, and will of his own race. It is even more than these things. It is the embodied vital will of great men. It is the contributions, defeats, failures, hopes, aspirations, and accomplishments of the ethnically related members of the group. Here, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The myth is the scaffolding, the superstructure on which all these other things are constructed. It is the skeleton around which the organic body is built. It is the framework which is covered over by a whole beautiful building. It is the form upon which, bit by bit, piece by piece, yard by yard, a people develops. But without the ordering of a myth, the people is merely a helter-skelter collection of all these various facts and facets. The myth may begin as a single event. Rosenberg identified his great event as the World War. It was the factor which made all the contributing elements coalesce around one central event. In and of itself, it defies rational description. It cannot be wholly isolated, for it works not on the body of man, but on his spirit. It works not a physical spell, but a metaphysical one. It touches not man's outer being, but his inner self, his spirit, his true personality. A nation without a vital myth drifts aimlessly throughout history. Myth gives purpose and meaning to the civilization. Myth makes a people a nation, and a nation a race, and a race a contributor to the world. Myth shapes the race so that the race may fulfill the potential of its individuals. The myth makes us conscious that we are a race, and not merely an arbitrary, purposeless, ill-defined conglomerate of men and women. The German Nordic race is unthinkable as a purposeful group, forming a civilization without its myth. That, Rosenberg argued, was the great problem of his contemporary Germany. It failed to develop a myth or to recognize it. It failed to see the necessity of having a directive myth in recent centuries. It lost the old Nordic myth, which was natural as its purpose had long ago been served, but it failed to develop or to listen to the voice of the new myth. It's seen the myth covered over, buried by false, non-Germanic mythi, such as those offered by the Jews and the Romans, referring indirectly to Christianity, of course. It took the terrible bloodletting of the First World War to force great leaders to acknowledge the new myth. Its cries were covered over so deeply that only such a powerful event could awaken the Aryan spirit. In that sense, at least, the suffering and deprivation of the war was worth the price. However, all would be futile if the internationalists and the ancient enemies of the Nordic people would be able to suppress the maturing myth. There have been many mythi. The Chinese developed one suited to their race, culture, and mind. So did the ancient inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent. The ancient Nordic peoples who inhabited North, East, and Central Europe also had a myth. The Nordic culture had spread southward, influencing the Greek and Roman mythi and people. Then, little by little, each group lost vital feeling for its myth, and the civilizations declined. The Chinese, Rosenberg said, had maintained their myth better than any other group, but they have not grown, and neither has their myth. It was a great and strong myth, but it did not permit competition. Its whole philosophy was unchallenged from within and without. It allowed for no change and no development. It even captured kindred peoples, like the Mongols and the Manchus, when they conquered China. The myth is good for a period of time, but is not meant to be eternal. The Chinese thus demonstrate to Rosenberg a highly inflexible character which can progress so far, but no further. Theirs is a changeless world, and would, left to its own devices, remain always so. But the influx of alien culture, notably of English, altered the old myth. The English, and Westerners in general, were themselves, to a limited degree, captured by the Chinese myth. I think he was referring to anime, but I'm not exactly sure. But since they simultaneously destroyed it, they really left a vacuum which the Chinese could not fill on their own. The great problem came in the short-range imperialistic conquest of the territory as against the long-range inculcation of the Western mind by the Chinese mystique. Since the myth had been tailored over centuries by learned members of that race, it cannot possibly be absorbed by the white race in a short time. Thus, Western civilization skimmed off parts of ideas and individual thoughts which in and of themselves are truly meaningless. They do not fit with the true Nordic myth, and they are not things which can stand on their own except in relationship to an entire state of mind and climate of opinion. The Indian myth was conquered by alien peoples who changed and altered the ancient Aryan mythi. They kept some of the old ways and ideas, but these were related to wholly different bases. The caste system was changed so that it became unrecognizable. The values were turned upside down. The organizational principles were turned inside out. Still, if one knows where to look, he can find traces of a myth that is very much akin to the old and new Nordic value system and myth. However, Rosenberg revolts against the idea of becoming enraptured by the Indian path to secular salvation. He objected to the acceptance of the strange reversals of logic and the manipulation of words that pass a profound philosophy. These he views merely as the last remnants of a wholly decadent society which is beyond a moral reconstruction. The old Nordic myth forms a powerful substructure on which to build a new myth. It developed significant and proper supreme values. It laid emphasis on honor and freedom and the inner worth of man. These values carry an internal compulsion within them. To a degree, ancient Indian mythi had just such supreme values, but they are all but lost today. One cannot merely imitate the old, but he can use what is good and eternal. The Nordic character was unchanging, so its Aryan precursors in India and Iran are instructive today. Germany can accept much of what ancient Nordic man built in prehistoric and certainly pre-Roman times, but he must move forward on his own. Mythi are formed, and first and foremost, by individuals' creative type. To comprehend what Rosenberg means here, we must first look a moment at Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche taught the doctrine of the overman, or the superman, who could create a whole new pattern of existence on his own. For Nietzsche, the world was eternal and history repeated itself endlessly and without meaning, but history was limited in its number and variety of expressive forms. One could achieve secular immortality, hence salvation without religion, if he could create a whole new type of person, a new form of human expression. To accomplish that, one had to place great emphasis on the person and his ego. He had to permit him to do whatever was useful and necessary to work that act of creation. All values had to be directed at the one supreme value, the Christian ethic of meekness, charity, humility, love, and so on had to be subordinated to the values serving of ego of the overman. The future would be merely a repetition of the past unless changed by the individual act of one man. Thus, one can speak of the unsuccessful overman as an individual incapable of forming types. For Rosenberg, type forming meant, in the large, myth forming, myth shaping, and myth discovering individuals. Such persons would be willing to risk all to create the new myth or to restore the supreme values of the old myth. They would be the rebels against the corrupt establishment. The individuals capable of forming types may carry his race only so far. Luther, for example, was unwilling to purge the Christian religion of its Jewish elements. He acknowledged that his idea of salvation through faith came from St. Paul. Had Luther been fully type-forming, he would have repudiated Paul for his Judaic ideas. Nonetheless, Luther can be regarded as type-forming, but not in a total sense. Rosenberg's ideal, Meister Eckhart, also failed to conform wholly to the ideal. He, like Luther, began a revolution, but he did not complete it. Nonetheless, he helped to form types of men who were able to move the race ahead. These early persons, capable of forming types, were the giants on whose shoulders others climbed so that they could see further. Leaders capable of forming types create a mold, a pattern. Others freely fit themselves into that mold. Friedrich the Great showed the values of honor and courage, and others followed that pattern. Once the masses came to recognize the necessity of these values, the myth had been created. This example of the great type-forming man weighs heavily on the shoulders of others. The example has a compelling quality about it. It provides the quality of action that inspires others to choose to follow freely. I admire Friedrich, and thus choose to make my life like his. In a secular field, it is precisely the same thing that one finds in religious terms with the saints. This is the true meaning of castes. One recognizes that certain men are above the masses. These true examples are to be followed. Mass leveling cannot be permitted. The recognition of the necessity of having fitters of types carries with it the recognition of placing such individuals in special places. True leadership, call it secular charisma, inspires others to follow unless some artificial leveling intervenes. If we can see leaders capable of forming types, we will have the true leadership that alone can carry society to its potential heights. The race is the beginning and the end of Rosenberg's thought. Without race, the myth is impossible, for it would be without roots. This is the end toward which all other values and actions are directed. It is the final and supreme value. It is the one and immutable value. Our individual being and value are determined by our membership and participation in our race.